telling signs of why they were redacted, right? Giving us an idea of a little bit of the picture of why they might be redacted. So I feel like this was kind of another joke to string it along a little bit. I'm pretty disappointed at what has been released. I definitely agree with Rokana that they could have picked and choose a lot better things to have released today if they weren't going to be able to release them all today. I can understand the amount of documents that they have and files and all of that, but Rokana said it perfectly, that there are important things, and I'm very sure that the DOJ is very aware of what important things that we are asking for as survivors. So to give us that in hopes that you guys could continue to go and continue to release the files would probably give us a little bit more hope, but right now I'm seeing the bare minimum, and even at the bare minimum,
You just watched a survivor of Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking network stand before you and tell you something you already knew in your bones but that our institutions refuse to acknowledge, that the release of these files announced with so much empty fanfare, a bitter disappointment, a parade of redactions hiding the truth, another insult piled upon decades of institutional betrayal, because when you listen to her voice cracking with frustration as she describes receiving a totally redacted 119-page document with no explanation for the redactions, what you are witnessing is not merely bureaucratic incompetence, but the deliberate architecture of impunity, a system engineered to protect the powerful at the expense of those they brutalized. And this should fill you with a rage that refuses to be tempered by procedural justifications or appeals to national security, because what we are discussing here is nothing less than the complete capture of our justice apparatus by the very forces it claims to regulate. The survivor in that clip is telling you that the Department of Justice knows exactly what documents matter, knows precisely which names survivors have been demanding for years, and yet they have not seen the draft indictment and witness interview memorandums that would reveal who were the rich and powerful men who abused these young girls, or who were at parties covering up the abuse. A deliberate choice that speaks to something far more sinister than administrative delay. And here is what should set your blood boiling. The massive document release was heavily redacted, incomplete, and shed little new light on his crimes, which is precisely what happens when institutions tasked with accountability become the primary instruments of concealment. And you need to understand that this is not some neutral failure of process, but an active conspiracy of silence, orchestrated by people who understand that their own legitimacy depends on keeping certain truths buried. Look at what the authors of the Epstein bill said: the release does not comply with their legislation. Legislators from both parties recognizing that the Trump administration has violated the law it signed, yet another example of how our political class operates above the rules they impose on everyone else. And the nauseating thing about all of this is that we are supposed to accept their excuses about protecting victims, when what they are actually protecting is a network of predation that extends into the highest echelons of American power. You want to talk about a two-tiered justice system? Let me tell you exactly what that phrase means in this context, because in practice one set punishes the poor and weak heavily and routinely, partly for gain of politicians, and another permits the wealthy and powerful to behave with comparative impunity, and the Epstein files represent perhaps the most crystalline example of this dynamic in modern American history, a case where more than a dozen politically exposed people and government officials' names appear in hundreds of thousands of pages, where more than 1,200 victims have been identifiers, and yet the response from our institutions is to black out the names, to protect the perpetrators, to ensure that those with wealth and connections never face the consequences that would destroy an ordinary person's life within minutes. The moral obscenity of this cannot be overstated, because what we are witnessing is the systematic erasure of accountability for some of the most heinous crimes imaginable: sex trafficking of children by a man whose entire operation depended on his relationships with political and financial elites, and the fact that a redacted masseuse list with more than 250 names, all redacted, exists somewhere in the bowels of the Justice Department tells you everything you need to know about whose interests are being served here. Now let me connect this to the broader ecosystem of elite corruption that defines our current political moment, because the normalization of political corruption in American politics has eroded the foundations of democratic governance, and the Epstein case is not an aberration, but rather the logical endpoint of a system where the line between public service and private gain continues to blur, as financial elites secure pardons and regulatory leniency following campaign contributions. What the survivor in that clip is describing is not just a failure to release documents, but a structural feature of how power operates in 21st century America, where citizens have correctly intuited that democratic institutions are no longer serving the public good. Yet the saviors voters are turning to are often strongmen, easily as corrupt as anyone who came before, creating a vicious cycle where legitimate grievances about elite impunity get weaponized by authoritarian figures who have no intention of actually challenging the system. The Trump administration's handling of these files is instructive because when power wants a story to die, it doesn't need to hide the truth. It only needs to declare the matter resolved. And what the Department of Justice did this summer, when it quietly issued its case-closed letter on Jeffrey Epstein, reveals not a completed investigation, but a carefully managed retreat, a bureaucratic performance designed to create the appearance of thoroughness while ensuring that no one truly powerful faces consequences. And this brings us to something absolutely critical that you need to internalize. It's to hold the government accountable for what they really failed to do, as Maria Farmer, the original whistleblower of the Epstein matter, came forward in 1996 and went to the FBI, which means that federal law enforcement knew about Epstein's operation for more than 2 decades before he was finally arrested in 2019, 2 decades during which he continued to traffic children with the full knowledge of institutions that could have stopped him at any moment. This is not a story about law enforcement doing their best in difficult circumstances. This is a story about institutional complicity, about a system that protected a predator because he had relationships with people in positions of power, and the fact that the DOJ and FBI said they did not uncover any evidence to warrant opening an investigation into any other person in Epstein's orbit, despite mountains of testimony from survivors identifying co-conspirators, should tell you that the fix was in from the beginning, that the whole machinery of federal law enforcement was mobilized not to pursue justice, but to contain the damage to reputations that matter. The survivor's voice in that clip carries the weight of this history when she talks about the DOJ being very aware of what important things we are asking for as survivors, because what she is saying is that this is not a matter of confusion or bureaucratic oversight, but of deliberate choice. Powerful people making conscious decisions to withhold information that would implicate other powerful people, and survivors want to make sure the perpetrator's information is not hidden and that they deserve to be held accountable, but accountability is precisely what our institutions are designed to prevent when it comes to the elite class. You can see this dynamic playing out in real time with telephone records from the investigation included in the new materials, but heavily redacted where you cannot see who was calling whom. A perfect microcosm of how the release was structured to give the appearance of transparency, while ensuring that no actual information of consequence becomes public, and this is how institutional power perpetuates itself, through technical compliance with demands for disclosure, while gutting those disclosures of any meaningful content. Now I want you to think about what this means for the broader question of elite accountability in American society, because what we are seeing with the Epstein files is part of a much larger pattern, with systemic corruption, widespread clientelism, and the capture of political systems by wealthy elites remain pervasive, weakening the foundations of democracy by eroding public trust in institutions. And this erosion is not accidental, but is the predictable result of decades of policy choices that have concentrated wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands while dismantling the regulatory and legal frameworks that might constrain that power. The survivor describes receiving the bare minimum from the DOJ, and even that characterization is generous because what they received was less than the minimum. It was an active insult, a demonstration that the government has no intention of providing real transparency. One lawmaker said he was very disappointed with the partial nature of the release, noting it's less about whether this is a full release and more about the quality of the release and what are they hiding. Which cuts to the heart of the matter, because the question is not whether every document can be released immediately, but whether the documents being withheld are being withheld to protect victims or to protect perpetrators. And let us be absolutely clear about who benefits from this arrangement, because in 2024 we have seen corruption weaponized to cement power through systemic manipulation, state capture, and the deliberate weakening of democratic institution. And the Epstein case represents state capture in its purest form, where the apparatus of government becomes a tool for protecting criminal networks run by and for the benefit of economic and political elites. When you hear that survivor say they feel like this was another joke to string it along a little bit, she is articulating something that millions of Americans understand intuitively, that we do not live in a society governed by law, but rather a society governed by power, where your access to justice is determined entirely by your position in the social hierarchy, and wealth essentially buys extra rights, creating a two-tiered system where wealth essentially buys extra rights, turning the entire premise of equal justice under law into a cruel fiction. The institutional mechanisms of this injustice are worth examining in detail because they reveal how power operates in supposedly democratic societies, and one of the most telling aspects of the Epstein file release, the DOJ was allowed to redact files to protect ongoing investigations, including the department's investigation into Clinton's and former Harvard president Larry Summers' ties to Epstein, and can also redact files for national security, which raises the obvious question of why investigations into specific individuals are being protected rather than expedited, why the existence of an investigation becomes an excuse for concealment rather than a reason for urgency. This is how institutional power insulates itself from accountability, by creating layers of process that can be invoked to justify indefinite delay, by claiming that releasing information would compromise investigations that may or may not exist, by weaponizing the very mechanisms ostensibly designed to ensure justice in order to prevent justice from being done. And you need to understand that this is happening in the context of a broader collapse of accountability for elite malfeasance, because the absence of effective anti-corruption measures promotes human rights violations and increases the influence of elites and organized crime on policymaking, creating a feedback loop where corruption enables more corruption, where the capture of institutions makes it impossible to reform those institutions, where the very people who should be investigating and prosecuting elite crime are themselves implicated in or compromised by that crime. The survivor's testimony about the DOJ knowing exactly what documents survivors have been requesting cuts through all the bureaucratic obfuscation, because she is saying that this is not a matter of institutional capacity, but of institutional will, that the government could release the documents that matter if it wanted to, but it chooses not to because those documents would implicate people who cannot be implicated without threatening the stability of the entire system. Let me break down what that system looks like in practice, because influence-wielding elites have set up myriad think tank, media, philanthropic, grassroots, nonprofit, and consulting entities to appear transparent and public interest serving, while in fact operating as vehicles of influence to achieve undisclosed agendas, and at the top of the food chain are shadow elites who break both democracy's rules of accountability and the free market's rules of competition, and Epstein was a perfect example of this phenomenon, a man whose actual source of wealth was always murky, whose connections to intelligence agencies have been documented but never fully explained, who operated at the intersection of finance, philanthropy, science, and politics in ways that gave him access to power while insulating him from scrutiny. The survivor is right to describe the file release as a joke, because what we are witnessing is not transparency but theater, a carefully choreographed performance designed to release just enough information to claim compliance with the law, while ensuring that nothing truly damaging ever sees the light of day. And here is where we need to talk about what this means for the survivors themselves, because Jeffrey Epstein is dead, but his hurt and his harm is alive and well in the daily experiences of these survivors. Maxwell is incarcerated, but it is these survivors, these victims, who are still very much in jail, and they are deserving of transparency, of accountability, and of healing. And our institutions are denying them all three through this cynical process of partial disclosure. When the survivor in that clip talks about the American people deserving better, she is connecting her own trauma to a broader social contract that has been systematically violated, recognizing that the failure to hold Epstein's co-conspirators accountable is not just an injustice to her and other survivors, but an assault on the principle that anyone can be held accountable. And this is not a political issue. This is a crime, and the crime is sex trafficking, but it has been transformed into a political issue, precisely because holding the perpetrators accountable would require acknowledging the complicity of people across the political spectrum. Now I want to dig into the specific tactics being used to bury this story, because they are instructive for understanding how elite power operates in the modern era. This wasn't the cinematic corruption of shredded files and backroom deals, but was procedural, bureaucratic, almost banal, with a letter here and a memo there, each step designed to create the impression of finality, a cover-up that was quiet, methodical, institutional, protecting not just specific individuals, but the department itself, because to reopen the Epstein case would mean reopening the failures of those who handled it originally. This is crucial to understand, because institutional self-preservation is a powerful force that operates independently of individual malfeasance, where people who may not personally have anything to hide nonetheless work to conceal information, because revealing that information would expose the incompetence or corruption of their predecessors, damaging the institution's reputation, and by extension their own position within it. The survivor's description of getting the bare minimum needs to be understood in this context, because one file containing grand jury materials was fully redacted in all black, and a document listing more than 200 masseuses in connection with the Epstein cases was fully redacted as well, which represents a complete abdication of the law's requirements, because there is no plausible victim protection rationale for redacting every single name on a list of potential witnesses or co-conspirators. This is redaction as obstruction, the use of victim protection as a pretext for perpetrator protection, and it should enrage you because it's been really upsetting and concerning to the survivors that Ghislaine Maxwell is being given any weight whatsoever, and they haven't been spoken to, the government choosing to interview and potentially rely on a convicted sex trafficker while ignoring the testimony of her victims, inverting the entire moral and legal framework that should govern these investigations. And we need to talk about the sheer scale of what is being concealed because some of the most sought-after information was redacted, including 119 pages of New York grand jury testimony, and there are witness interviews between the FBI and other people who were accused of being at Jeffrey Epstein's rape island or going to parties where there were 16 and 17-year-old girls being paraded around, and those witness memorandums need to be released, but they are not being released because releasing them would identify specific individuals who participated in or facilitated Epstein's crimes, individuals who remain free and in many cases remain influential. This is not speculation but a logical inference from the pattern of redactions, from the specific documents being withheld, from the government's refusal to provide justifications for those redactions as required by law, that prompted criticism from Democrats who argued the administration was not in compliance with the law, with one lawmaker saying technically they're not in compliance because the law calls for all the documents that are unclassified to be released and they have not done that, and the law also calls for them to explain redactions, creating a situation where the government is in open violation of a statute it signed into law just weeks ago. Now let's talk about what this tells us about the functioning of American democracy in the 21st century, because what we are witnessing is not an exception but the rule, not a unique failure but a systemic feature. For decades, the Supreme Court has whittled down campaign finance regulations and narrowed the legal definition of how the influence of money in politics can count as corruption, starting with Buckley v. Valeo in 1976 and continuing through Citizens United, sparking an explosion of political spending, particularly from super PACs that can raise and spend unlimited amounts, allowing ultra-wealthy donors to dominate politics in ways that were illegal before Citizens United, and in another series of cases, the court pared back federal criminal anti-corruption statutes, stripped away checks on presidential power, and by carving out vast swaths of conduct from accountability, narrowing the scope of what counts as corrupt, these decisions create an environment that emboldens bad behavior from public officials. The Epstein case is unfolding against this backdrop, where the legal infrastructure for holding elite wrongdoers accountable has been systematically dismantled, where conduct that would have been prosecuted as corruption a generation ago is now considered business as usual, and where the few remaining tools for enforcement are wielded selectively to protect the powerful while punishing the vulnerable. The survivor's testimony about the DOJ being aware of what survivors are asking for should be understood as an indictment of this entire system, because she is saying that the problem is not lack of information or resources, but lack of will, that the government knows exactly what it should do and is choosing not to do it, and they are exhausted by decades of delayed justice, and urged lawmakers to unite behind the survivors of his abuse, rather than let conspiracy theories and speculation thrive in the vacuum created by the Trump administration's refusal to release any additional documents, connecting the institutional failure to release documents with the proliferation of conspiracy theories that serve to muddy the waters and make it harder to focus on the actual documented crimes. This is another tactic of institutional power, to allow the information vacuum to be filled with speculation and paranoia, so that when actual evidence does emerge, it gets lost in a fog of claims and counterclaims, making it impossible for the public to distinguish between credible allegations and baseless conspiracy theories. And you need to understand that this is all happening while through tears. A group of women who say they were victimized by Jeffrey Epstein shared their stories on Capitol Hill, calling on lawmakers to support the release of records that the Department of Justice has withheld from Congress, saying this is not a hoax and it's not going to go away, survivors having to publicly relive their trauma in order to pressure institutions that should be working on their behalf, and the fact that Trump continued to insist it was an Epstein hoax distracting from his administration's success, calling it a Democrat hoax that never ends, while his own Department of Justice refuses to comply with transparency requirements, demonstrates the complete moral bankruptcy of those in power. The cruelty of this cannot be overstated. Survivors of child sex trafficking, forced to advocate for basic accountability, while the President of the United States dismisses their suffering as political theater, and this is what happens when institutions are captured by people who view everything through the lens of power and self-interest, rather than justice and human dignity. Let me connect this back to the broader architecture of inequality that defines contemporary America, because for the past 2 decades, preferential treatment has gone from the exceptional to the ordinary, as part of a broader cultural shift where America has come to equate elite interest with the national interest, and this type of preferential treatment has gone from the exceptional to the ordinary, as part of a broader cultural shift where America has come to equate elite interest with the national interest, and the Epstein case is a perfect encapsulation of this dynamic, where the interests of wealthy and connected individuals are treated as synonymous with institutional stability, where protecting powerful people from accountability is framed as protecting institutions, when in reality it is destroying the legitimacy of those institutions. The survivor's frustration with receiving only the bare minimum reflects an understanding that she and others like her are not considered important enough to warrant full transparency, that their suffering matters less than the reputations of the powerful people who inflicted that suffering. And we need to be explicit about what is being protected here, because at the heart of the findings is the concept of state capture, where corruption becomes the norm and the primary means of governance, where the state apparatus is frequently used to enrich specific groups at the expense of the broader public, and elite privilege defined as access to subsidies, tax relief, and lucrative state contracts for a select few drains billions of dollars from the economy annually, while tax evasion and regulatory capture crowd out genuine private sector investment. Epstein's operation was fundamentally about elite privilege, about a man who could traffic children with impunity because he provided services to people with power, whether those services were financial advice, political connections, scientific legitimacy, or the more sinister services that survivors have testified about, and the DOJ's refusal to fully disclose what it knows about Epstein's network is an exercise in preserving that system of elite privilege against the threat of democratic accountability. The survivor in that clip is speaking a truth that our institutions cannot acknowledge without undermining their own legitimacy, that justice in America is not blind, but is acutely aware of wealth and status, that our legal system serves primarily to maintain existing hierarchies of power rather than to correct injustices, that using criminal law as a weapon or a political tool is objectionable, even outrageous, only when directed against someone who implicitly should be out of reach of the criminal apparatus, someone too rich, too popular, too powerful, and this reveals the fundamental moral corruption at the heart of our justice system, where the very concept of accountability is understood to apply only to certain classes of people. When she talks about the DOJ giving them the bare minimum, she is describing a system that views her and other survivors as supplicants rather than as people with rights, where the government doles out information as a favor rather than as an obligation, where transparency is treated as a privilege granted to victims rather than as a fundamental requirement of democratic governance. And now let's talk about what needs to happen, because the current situation is intolerable. By refusing to accept corruption as an unavoidable part of politics and demanding accountability through reporting, whistleblowing, and political pressure, citizens can bring about real change, as the rising threat of concentrated wealth and power dominating our political system demands a strong response and common-sense reforms, where in the short term, Congress should restore checks and balances and anti-corruption guardrails that the current administration has dismantled, expand federal ethics reforms to close loopholes that exempt the president and other top officials from basic conflict of interest safeguards, and overhaul campaign finance rules to counter the worst effects of the Supreme Court's misguided decisions. But these reforms will not happen spontaneously. They require organized pressure from below, from survivors who refuse to accept institutional stonewalling, from citizens who recognize that their own freedom depends on a functioning system of accountability, from movements that connect elite impunity in cases like Epstein to the broader structure of inequality that immiserates millions. The survivor's voice carries within it both rage and hope. Rage at a system that continues to betray those it claims to protect, hope that enough pressure can force institutions to change. Lawmakers are continuing their push for healing and accountability, the release of the full Epstein files with survivors' names redacted, and a full, transparent, and public congressional hearing that centers survivors that want to share testimony, which represents at minimum what should happen immediately, not as a concession but as a basic requirement of democratic governance. But we should be clear-eyed about the obstacles, because the people being protected by these redactions are not without resources or influence, because whole practices of corruption are aided by system smashing, where those who might provide a check against them find themselves unwelcome in government, and the culture of impunity that is created along with the violation of long-standing norms make it harder to hold anyone to account, creating an environment where abuse of power becomes normalized, and where the tools for challenging that abuse are systematically degraded. What that survivor is telling you in her testimony is that we have reached a point where the gap between the principles we claim to uphold and the reality of how power operates has become so vast that it threatens the entire social contract, where hearing the Epstein case described as a hoax was like being gutted from the inside out, because it represents the ultimate gaslighting, telling victims of documented crimes that their suffering is invented for political purposes. And this is what happens in authoritarian systems where power becomes completely untethered from accountability, where the powerful can commit crimes in plain sight and then mobilize the machinery of government to cover up those crimes while attacking anyone who demands justice. The fact that House Democrats accused Trump and the Department of Justice of violating federal law as they continue covering up facts and evidence about Jeffrey Epstein's decades-long billion-dollar international sex trafficking ring, noting that for months Pam Bondi has denied survivors the transparency and accountability they have demanded and deserve, and has defied the Oversight Committee's subpoena, and the Department of Justice is now making clear it intends to defy Congress itself, even as it gives star treatment to Epstein's convicted co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell, demonstrates that we are witnessing not just a failure of justice, but an open assault on the rule of law by people who understand that they can act with impunity because the mechanisms that might constrain them have been captured or destroyed. And so when you hear that survivor's voice breaking as she describes another disappointment, another betrayal, another insult piled upon years of trauma, you need to understand that she is not just speaking for herself, or even just for other Epstein survivors, but for everyone who has ever been crushed by institutions that claim to serve justice while actually serving power, for everyone who has watched the wealthy and connected escape consequences that would destroy ordinary people, for everyone who understands that we cannot have democracy without accountability, and we cannot have accountability when those tasked with enforcing it are themselves complicit in the crimes they should be investigating. This is the fundamental crisis of our time, not just specific instances of elite corruption, but the complete capture of institutions by the forces they were designed to constrain, creating a system where the appearance of democracy masks the reality of oligarchy, where rights exist on paper but not in practice for those without money or influence, where justice is not a right but a commodity available only to those who can afford to purchase it. The release of these redacted files is not the end of this story, but rather another chapter in an ongoing struggle over who gets to be held accountable and who gets to operate above the law. And the survivor's testimony is a call to action for everyone who understands that their own freedom is implicated in whether people with power can be forced to face consequences for their crimes. We need to build movements that connect these struggles, that recognize the through line between unpunished elite crime and the daily violence of inequality, that refuse to accept institutional excuses for failure, and instead demand transformation of institutions that have proven themselves incapable of serving justice. Because ultimately what is at stake here is not just whether Epstein's co-conspirators face accountability, though that matters tremendously, but whether we live in a society where accountability is possible at all, whether democratic institutions can be reclaimed from elite capture, whether the principle that no one is above the law can be made real rather than remaining an empty slogan deployed to legitimate a fundamentally illegitimate system. And that survivor standing there telling you that the DOJ is running a cover-up, that they know what documents matter, and are choosing not to release them, that she and others are being strung along with the bare minimum while the perpetrators remain protected. She is offering you a choice, to accept this state of affairs as inevitable, or to join the fight to make accountability real, to center survivors rather than their abusers, to build a world where justice is not a privilege but a right that belongs to everyone, regardless of wealth or status or connection to power.